Hi guys, so we're back again. We have some more chapters to Reptile Room. We have 3 chapters left. We'll see how it goes if I do 1, 2, or 3 chapters today. So chapter 11. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet was upstairs surveying her bedroom with a critical eye. She took a deep breath, then tied her hair in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. As you and I and everyone who is familiar with Violet know, when she ties her hair back like that, it is because she needs to think of an invention, and right now she needed to think of one quickly. Violet had realized when her brother had talked about Stefano ordering them to carry his suitcase to the house that the evidence she had been looking for undoubtedly was in that very suitcase. And now, while her siblings were distracting the adults in the reptile room, would be her only opportunity to open the suitcase and retrieve proof of Stefano's evil plot. But her aching shoulder was a reminder that she couldn't simply open the suitcase. It was locked, with a lock as shiny as Stefano's scheming eyes. I confess that if I were in Violet's place with only a few minutes to open a locked suitcase, instead of on a deck of my friend Bella's yacht writing this down, I probably would have given up hope. I would have sunk into the floor of the bedroom and pounded my fists against the carpet, wondering why in the world life was so unfair and filled with inconveniences. Luckily for the Baudelaires, however, Violet was made of sterner stuff, and she took a good look around her bedroom for anything that might help her. There wasn't much in the way of inventing materials. Violet longed for a good room in which to invent things, filled with wires and gears and all the necessary equipment to invent really top-notch devices. Uncle Monty was in fact in possession of many of these supplies, but to Violet's frustration, as she thought of this, they were located in the reptile room. She looked at the pieces of butcher paper tacked to the wall where she had hoped to sketch out inventions as she lived in Uncle Monty's house. The trouble began so quickly that Violet had only a few scribblings on one of the sheets, which she had written by the light of a floor lamp on her first night here. Violet's eyes traveled to the floor lamp as she remembered that evening when she reached the electric socket. She had an idea. We all know, of course, that we should never, ever. I'll show you. This is how many evers are there. No, I'm not going to read them all. No, it's a lot of evers. Ever fiddle around in any way with an electrical devices. Never. There are 2 reasons for this. One is that you can get electrocuted, which is not only deadly, but very unpleasant. And the other is that you are not Violet Baudelaire, one of the few people in the world who know how to handle such things. And even Violet was very careful and nervous as she unplugged the lamp and took out a long look at the plug itself. It might work. Hoping that Klaus and Sonny were continuing to stall the adults successfully, Violet wiggled the 2 prongs of the plug this way and that until the last came loose from their plastic casing. She now had 2 small metal strips. Violet then took one of the thumbtacks of the butcher paper, letting the paper curl down the wall as if it were lazy. With the sharp end of the tack, she poked and prodded the 2 pieces of metal until one was hooked around the other, and then forced the thumbtack between the 2 pieces so the sharp end stuck out straight. The result looked like a piece of metal you might not notice if it lay in the street, but in fact that Violet had made was crude. The word crude here means roughly made at the last minute, rather than rude or ill-mannered. Lockpick. Lockpicks, as you know, are devices that work as if they were proper keys, usually used by bad guys to rob houses or escape from jail, but this one was one of the rare times when a lockpick was being used by a good guy, Violet Baudelaire. Violet looked quickly back down the stairs, holding her lockpick in one hand and crossing her fingers with the other. She tiptoed past the enormous door of the reptile room and hoped that her absence would not be noticed as she slipped outside. Deliberately averting her eyes from Dr. Lucafon's car to avoid catching even a glimpse of Uncle Monty's body, the eldest Baudelaire walked toward the pile of suitcases. She looked first at the old ones belonging to the Baudelaires. Those suitcases contained, she remembered, lots of ugly, itchy clothing that Mrs. Poe had bought for them soon after their parents died. For a few seconds, Violet found herself staring at the suitcases, remembering how effortless her life had been before all this trouble had set upon them, and how surprisingly it was to find herself in such miserable circumstances now. This may not be surprising to us because we know how disastrous the lives of the Baudelaire orphans are, but Violet's misfortune was constantly surprising her, and it took a minute to push thoughts of her situation out of her head and to concentrate on what she had to do. She knelt down to get closer to Stefano's suitcase, held the shiny silver padlock in one hand and took a deep breath, and stuck the lockpick into the keyhole. It went inside. When she tried to turn it around, it scarcely budged, only scraped a little at the inside of the keyhole. It needed to move more smoothly or it would never work. Violet took her lockpick out, wet it with her mouth, grimacing at the stale taste of metal. Then she stuck the lockpick in the keyhole again and tried to move it. It wiggled slightly and then lay still. Violet took the lockpick out and thought very, very hard, retying her hair in the ribbon. She cleared the hair from her eyes, though, and felt a sudden prickle on her skin. It was unpleasant and familiar. It was the feeling of being watched. She looked quickly behind her, but she only saw the snake-safe hedges on the lawn. She looked side to side now and saw only the driveway leading down to Lousy Lane, but then she looked straight ahead through the glass walls of the reptile room. It had never occurred to her that people could see through the reptile room's walls as clearly as they could see out. And when she looked up, Violet could see through the cages of the reptiles the figure of Mr. Poe leaping up and down excitedly. You and I know, of course, that Mr. Poe was panicking over Sunny and the incredible deadly viper, but all Violet knew was that whatever ruse her siblings had devised was still working. The prickle in her skin was not explained, however, until she looked a little closer just to the right of Mr. Poe and saw that Stefano was looking right back at her. Her mouth fell open in surprise and panic. She knew any second now Stefano could invent an excuse to leave the reptile room and come find her, and she hadn't even opened the suitcase. Quickly, she had to find some way to make her lockpick work. She looked down at the damp gravel of the driveway and up at the dim yellowish afternoon sun. She looked down at her own hand, smudged with dust from picking apart the electric plug, and that's when she thought of something. Jumping to her feet, Violet sprinted back into the house as if Stefano were already after her, and she pushed her way through the door into the kitchen. Shoving a chair to the floor in her haste, she grabbed a bar of soap from the dripping sink. She rubbed the slippery substance carefully over her lockpick until the entire invention had a thin, slick coating. Her heart pounding in her chest, she ran back outside, taking a hurried look through the walls of the reptile room. Stefano was saying something to Mr. Poe. He was bragging about his expertise of snakes, but Violet had no way of knowing that, and Violet took this moment to kneel down and stick the lockpick back into the keyhole of the padlock. It spun quickly all the way around and then snapped in two, right in her hands. There was a faint sputter of a sound as one half fell to the grass and the other still sticking in the keyhole like a jagged tooth. Her lockpick was destroyed. Violet closed her eyes for a moment in despair and then pulled herself to her feet, using the suitcase to gain her balance. When she put her hand on her suitcase, however, the padlock swung open and the case tipped open and spilled everything all over the ground. Violet fell back down in surprise. Somehow, as the lockpick turned, it must have unstuck the lock. Sometimes, even the most unfortunate of our lives, there will occur a moment or two of good fortune. This is very difficult, experts have told us, to find a needle in a haystack, which is why needle in a haystack has become a rather hackneyed phrase, meaning something that is difficult to find. The reason it is difficult to find a needle in the haystack, of course, is that out of all the things in a haystack, the needle is only one of them. However, if you're looking for anything in a haystack, it wouldn't be difficult at all, because once you started sifting through the haystack, you would most certainly find something. Hay, of course, but also dirt, bugs, a few farming tools, and maybe even a man who escaped from prison and was hiding there. When Violet searched through the contents of Stefano's suitcase, it was more like looking for anything in a haystack, because she didn't know exactly what she wanted to find. Therefore, it was actually fairly easy to find useful items in terms of evidence. A glass vial with a sealed rubber cap, as one might find in a scientific laboratory, a syringe with a sharp needle like the one your doctor used to give you shots, a small bunch of folded papers, a card laminated in plastic, a powder puff, and a small hand mirror. Even though she knew she only had a few more moments, Violet separated these items from the smelly clothes and bottle of wine that were also in the suitcase, and looked at all her evidence very carefully, concentrating on each item as if there were small parts out of the way she was going to make a machine. And in a way they were. Violet Baudelaire needed to arrange these pieces of evidence to defeat Stefano's evil plan, and bring justice and peace to the lives of the Baudelaire orphans for the first time since their parents perished in a terrible fire. Violet gazed at each piece of evidence, thinking very hard, and before too long, her face lit up the way it always did when all the pieces of something were fit together properly and the machine worked just the way it should. Chapter 12. I promise you that this is the last time I'll use the phrase, meanwhile back at the ranch, but I can think of no other way to return to the moment when Klaus had just explained to Mr. Poe what Sunny meant by shouting, "Aha," and how everyone in the reptile room was staring at Stefano. Sunny looked triumphant, Klaus looked defiant. Mr. Poe looked furious, Dr. Lukafont looked worried. You could tell how the incredible deadly viper looked, because the facial expressions of a snake are difficult to read. Stefano looked back at all these people silently, his face fluttering as he tried to decide whether to come clean, a phrase which here would mean, admit he's really Count Olaf and up to no good, or perpetuate his deception, a phrase which here means, lie, lie, lie. Stefano, Mr. Poe said and coughed into his handkerchief. Klaus and Sunny waited impatiently for him to continue. Stefano, explain yourself. You have just told us that you are an expert on snakes. Previously, however, you told us you knew nothing of snakes, and therefore couldn't have been involved in Dr. Montgomery's death. What is going on? When I told you I knew nothing of snakes, Stefano said, I was being modest. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to go outside for a moment and... You weren't being modest, Klaus cried. You were lying, and you are lying now. You are nothing but a liar and a murderer. Stefano's eyes grew wide and his face clouded in anger. You have no evidence of that, he said. Yes, we do, said a voice in the doorway, and everyone turned around to find Violet standing there, with a smile on her face and evidence in her arms. Triumphantly, she walked across the reptile room to the far end, where the books Klaus had been reading about the Mamba du Mal were stacked in a pile. The others followed her, walking down the aisles of reptiles. Silently, she arranged the objects in a line on the top of a table. The glass vial with the sealed rubber cap, the syringe with the sharp needle, a small bunch of folded papers, a card laminated in plastic, the powder puff, and a small hand mirror. "What is all this?" Mr. Poe said, gesturing to the arrangement. "This," Violet said, "is evidence which I found in Stefano's suitcase." "My suitcase," Stefano said, "is private property, which you are not allowed to touch. It is very rude of you, and besides, it was locked." "It was an emergency," Violet said calmly, "so I picked the lock." "How did you do that?" Mr. Poe asked. "Nice girls shouldn't know how to do such things." "My sister is a nice girl," Klaus said, "and she knows how to do all sorts of things." "Who fick?" Sonny agreed. "We will discuss that later," Mr. Poe said. "In the meantime, please continue." "When Uncle Monty died," Violet began, "my siblings and I were very sad, but we were also very suspicious." "We weren't suspicious," Klaus exclaimed. "If someone is suspicious, it means they're not sure. We were positive that Stefano killed him." "Nonsense," Dr. Lucafon said. "As I explained to all of you, Montgomery's death was an accident. The Mamba du Mal escaped from its cage and bit him. That's all there is to it." "I beg your pardon," Violet said, "but it's not all there is to it." Klaus read up on the Mamba du Mal and found how it kills its victims. Klaus walked over to the stack of books and opened the one on top. He had marked his place with a small piece of paper, so he found what he was looking for right away. "The Mamba du Mal," he read out loud, "is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving all of its victims a tenebrious hue, which is ghastly to behold." He put the book down and turned to Mr. Poe. "Strangulatory means—" "We know what the words mean," Stefano shouted. "Then you must know," Klaus said, "that the Mamba du Mal did not kill Uncle Monty. His body didn't have a tenebrious hue. He was as pale as could be." "That's true," Mr. Poe said, "but it doesn't necessarily indicate that Dr. Montgomery was murdered." "Yes," Dr. Lucafon said. "Perhaps just this once the snake didn't feel like bruising its victim." "It is more likely," Violet said, "that Uncle Monty was killed with these items." She held up the glass vial with the sealed rubber cap. "This vial is labeled Venom du Mal. It is obviously from Uncle Monty's cabinet of venom samples." Then she held up the syringe with the sharp needle. Olaf, took this syringe and injected the venom into Uncle Monty. Then he poked an extra hole so it looked like the snake had bitten him. "But I love Dr. Montgomery," Stefano said. "I would have nothing to gain from his death." Sometimes when someone tells a ridiculous lie, it is best to ignore it entirely. "When I turn 18, as we all know," Violet continued, ignoring Stefano entirely, "I inherit the Baudelaire fortune, and Stefano intended to get that fortune for himself. It would be easier to do so if we were in a location that was more difficult to trace, such as Peru." Violet held up a small bunch of folded papers. "These are tickets for the Prospero, leaving Hazy Harbor for Peru at 5 o'clock today. That's where Stefano was taking us when we happened to run into you, Mr. Poe." "But Uncle Monty tore up Stefano's ticket to Peru," Klaus said, looking confused. "I saw him." "That's true," Violet said. "That's why he got Uncle Monty out of the way. He killed Uncle Monty." Violet stopped for a minute and shuddered. "He killed Uncle Monty and took his laminated card. It's Monty's membership card for the Herpetological Society. Stefano planned to pose as Uncle Monty to get aboard the Prospero and whisk us away to Peru." "But I don't understand," Mr. Poe said. "How did Stefano even know about your fortune?" "Because he's really Count Olaf," Violet said, exasperated that she had to explain what she and her siblings and you and I knew at the moment Stefano arrived at the house. "He may have shaved his head and trimmed off his eyebrows, but the only way he could get rid of the tattoo on his left ankle was with this powder puff and hand mirror. There's makeup all over his left ankle to hide the eye, and I bet if we rub it with a cloth we can see the tattoo." "That's absurd," Stefano cried. "We'll see about that," Mr. Poe replied. "Now, who has a cloth?" "Not me," Klaus said. "Not me," Violet said. "Gooeel," Sonny said. "Well, if nobody has a cloth, we might as well forget the whole thing," Dr. Lucafon said, but Mr. Poe held up a finger to tell him to wait. To the relief of the Baudelaire orphans, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his handkerchief. "Your left ankle, please," he said sternly to Stefano. "But you've been coughing into it all day," Stefano said. "It has germs." "If you really are who the children say you are," Mr. Poe said, "then the germs are the least of your problems. Your left ankle, please." Stefano, and this is the last time, thank goodness, we'll have to call him by his phony name, gave a little growl and pulled up his left pants leg up to reveal his ankle. Mr. Poe knelt down and rubbed it for a few moments. At first, nothing appeared to happen, but then, like a sun shining through the clouds at the end of a terrible rainstorm, the faint outline of an eye began to appear. Clearer and clearer it grew until it was as dark as it had been when the orphans first saw it, back when they lived with Count Olaf. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny all stared at the eye, and the eye stared back. For the first time in their lives, the Baudelaire orphans were happy to see it. All right, the last chapter is kind of long, and I'm not going to make you wait until next week, but expect it sometime this week. We'll double one up. So you'll get a picture book and then the last chapter of the Reptile Room. So you'll get to see how that one ends. All right, I miss you guys, and I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you later. Bye.